the challenge was learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. That my discomfort isn't an excuse or a reason to go out and sacrifice the great talents that I was given.
Hey guys, I'm Ashley Dawn Rivard, and you are now Into the Dawn, a provocative podcast that looks at all things taboo, such as suicide, grief, sex, addictions, and more. Each week, I talk with experts who successfully investigate their areas of interest. And if you like what you hear, please remember to subscribe. Neuroscientist and executive leadership coach Dr. Tara Swart surveyed journalists and found that despite constant deadlines, unpredictable work schedules, and alcoholism, journalists are fairly resilient to stresses due to their high sense of purpose. Paul VanDevelder has a varied career as an author, journalist, and screenwriter. His work has taken him all over the world, covering war zones, presidential campaigns, and natural disasters. He also has a very intimate relationship with mental health, as he has come face to face with it throughout his career. So take me back to, your career in a way of the start of, is it the journalism or you going across covering wars that...
How did all that happen?
Yeah.
I knew journalism it was a fit for a number of reasons. One, I was a natural iconoclast.
Mm-hmm.
And
Which
means those people in society who challenge standard norms and conventions and institutions.
Got it.
And I knew journalism was loaded with iconoclasts.
Mm-hmm.
It was the natural home for the iconoclast and the misfit. I mean, journalism has a long, long history of people who fall into that sort of category. And I had some incredible mentors, Raymond Gaiman, who eventually went to work for the National Geographic, Carl DeVos, Tom Dodge. These are names that people in the photojournalism world know.
Right.
And they were ahead of me, but they took care of me. That landed me. That was a one way. That was my ticket. And the next thing I knew, I was working for UPI and covering the civil wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador.
So how old were you at this point?
I was 28.
Okay, very
29
young.
years old. Yeah.
Wow. So when did your addiction start?
Oh, I think the addiction probably started at birth.
Oh, really?
I think there are two forms of the addiction that come together at some point. There's the social side of the addiction, and then there's the DNA biochemical side of addiction. And you could probably, I think, for example, my mom had the biochemical side, but she never drank, so she never became an alcoholic or a drug addict. She was clean her whole life. She was the kind of person who would have 2 glasses of sherry at dinner and we'd have to carry her up to bed.
Right. Yeah, I do know.
And she knew this was something she wanted to stay away from.
Yeah.
Her dad was a raging alcoholic.
Okay.
Her brother was an alcoholic.
Okay.
So there was a social side and the biochemical side. Those two came together for me in my early 30s.
Do you feel that your career pushing towards that more?
I would have become an alcoholic regardless of what career I would have.
Interesting.
Whether I had been a doctor or a priest, it wouldn't have mattered. I think eventually my underlying discomfort with being in my own skin and then walking around in that skin in a world that made no sense to me was the natural setup for, it certainly fueled the addiction, because the minute I discovered alcohol, I felt at home.
Okay. So
for the first time.
It's interesting how it can do that, right?
Yes, it is.
So as long as you can remember, you just felt uncomfortable in your skin.
I did. There were moments when I felt integrated. It takes a lifetime to integrate yourself into the world if you're a natural born iconoclast. Totally. Which is one of the reasons alcoholism is so rampant among journalists.
Is it? I didn't know that.
Absolutely.
What's the percentage?
Oh, notorious. It's really high. But every day when we went to deadline and the presses were rolling, we went right out the door to the bar across the street. It's no accident. You read Pete Hamill's great book, his great book, The Life of a Drunk. He's one of the great journalists of the 20th century and one of the great writers. And he talks about from the time he was a copy editor, the minute they hit deadline, they just walked right out the front door of the newspaper and into the front door of a bar across the street. And the place was filled with journalists.
Now, do you think it's because it's heavy work they're doing, intense? Or do you think it stems from there's a certain genetic makeup that people go into journalism and you all share that thing, right? You're writing stories, the vulnerability of putting your story out there, not knowing how it's going to be perceived.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of all of those, and each person is going to fall on the spectrum somewhere. But let me answer that question or give you a piece of insight, or perhaps a piece of insight by telling you what I used to tell the people that I hired. They'd be 21 years old, talented as heck, gung-ho, ready to go, couldn't wait to get out there. And I'd sit them down before they went out on their first day of an assignment. And I'd say, I want you to know something. I didn't do you any favors by hiring you. I've hired you to do a job you're probably not going to be ready to do for at least another 10 years. You're too young. You're going to walk out that door every single day you come to work, and you're going to be dealing with people at the worst moment of their lives. Total strangers. You're going to have humanity. You're going to have incredible amount of compassion, and you're going to have to make decisions on the fly, and only you will know in the end whether you made a right one, a good one, or a bad one. And when you live with that every day, it's a different world. So I saw many years later when I was getting ready to retire from photojournalism, I saw a survey of the 300 stress ranked in the 300 professions. So they listed 300 professions and ranked them according to the amount of stress that people had to deal with. In the top 5, not top 5%, but the top 5 was big city firemen, trauma room physicians, and photojournalists.
Really? That is fascinating. That's so interesting.
Reporters were down around 40 to 50. The reason being, as a photojournalist, and it's the same for the very same thing I would tell those new hires. As a photojournalist, whether you're in a car wreck or whether you're covering a war or you're walking through a refugee camp or you're walking through a battlefield, you can't do it on the phone. You can't do it remote.
Yeah.
You have to get dirty. I used to say that was a saying we had in the darkroom. Get dirty. Something would break on the squawk box. Something was going down, and that was the last words you heard when you went out the door. Somebody would yell, "Get dirty," meaning do it. You know what you're going to have to do when you get there. You're going to have to get dirty.
Wow.
You're going to have to take it on emotionally and psychologically and come back and do your job.
Oh, yeah.
That's tough.
Well, there's a lot, I would imagine there's some PTSD in that too.
Absolutely. And we never thought about PSD. We went across the street to the bar.
Right.
So in a war zone, you'd come back from, in El Salvador, I'd come back from the refugee camps or from some other brush with insanity and mortality. And all the journalists I knew would be lined up in the bar at the hotel. Yeah. And they were good natured about it. I mean, they were, these people are the life of the party. These people have extraordinary creative energy and whatnot.
Right.
But this is just what they do to numb it out a little bit for the moment.
Right.
So would I have become, I've known a lot of priests who are alcoholics. I've known it has nothing to do with profession, as we know. But because journalism was a natural home for the iconoclast, and the iconoclast typically feels at odds with the world and often with their own skin. The natural home for the iconoclast after work was the bar.
We're all kind of hiding something, maybe unconsciously, right? Running from self, doing, and being in work environment with the high pressure that you had experienced. Do you feel at that moment you were hiding just, you were having success in your career, but you were still hiding in the sense, like, if you're going to the bar to drink it, like, was it your pain or your trauma or your vulnerability?
I would answer that by saying, I think I was at that time, at that point in my life, I'd have to look at whether it was when I was 28 or 33 or 35, because I developed a lot during that period of time. In some ways, I was paying forward authenticity. It takes an enormous amount, in my experience, for me personally, it takes an enormous amount of courage to really live an authentic life, whether you're an iconoclast or not. If you are an iconoclast, I think it takes that extra bit of special sauce to get to find your way into that authenticity, because you develop these compensatory mechanisms of behavior that allow you to sort of move along in the world, in the conventional world, without creating a lot of waves,
Absolutely.
But what you are also intensely aware of as a journalist, I'll go back. The people that I worked with in the newsroom, we all knew the score. We all knew what was going on. I mean, you had personality issues with people and whatnot, but we all knew what the score was. We knew what we were dealing with. And there was a lot of authenticity and powerful sharing in the newsroom that we wouldn't do outside of the newsroom.
Right, okay.
Because you simply wouldn't have the medium of exchange with people outside of that environment, who you just get blank stares and dumb looks when you try to explain something that just went down. So the question, coming back to your question, it's a long and gradual process of coming to that reckoning with the duality of living, being uncomfortable in your own skin, and finding that place finally of authenticity. This is the challenge. This is truly a road less traveled. What you encounter along that road are a lot of people behind a lot of masks. And when you finally have the opportunity to put the mask down, everything changes. All terms of engagement change. And everywhere you go, it takes yet another period of life to grow into a place where you don't have to be judgmental of the people. You see their misery, you see their anguish, you see the loneliness behind them. And yet it's not your job. It's not your job. And yet you feel, so what you end up with is, I did, I recently took that Myers-Briggs personality test, and here I was, surprise, surprise, an ENFP-PT, and they explained in the analysis following that designation that I'm among 2.5% to 3% of men fall into that category, and it's characterized by deep compassion. I think as a journalist, when you've seen so much misery and so much anguish in the world, you go one of two ways. You become a rock, a completely unfeeling rock, because you cannot deal with your own response to that, or you become deeply compassionate and understanding. And yet that moment is a choice often. Completely. That moment, that fork in the road, as most of us face in life, many forks in the road. That's a distinguished fork in the road. When you say no, I'm not going that way. I'm going this way. And I chose I chose without really understanding what the terms of engagement were going to be. I chose the road to compassion. Mm-hmm. Partly because I was so inspired by my own parents and the family I grew up in. So this is where the circle started. This is where I got incredibly lucky as an addict and an alcoholic. I had a picture to live back into. When I got clean and sober and got through that first year of physical discomfort and that second year of emotional adjustment and rebalancing and that third year of spiritual quest and encounter and discovery, when I got through that in those initial periods, there was a world there waiting for me to step back into that I had grown up in. I had been raised in.
Yeah.
And I've known so many. That just deepens my compassion for so many people I have met in the rooms and in various other places who are alcoholics or addicts or whatever, who didn't have that. They started drinking when they were 8 or 9 or 10. They grew up in chronically dysfunctional environments. They didn't have a model of what it was to be caring, loving, and nurturing.
Right.
They knew anger. They knew violence. They knew abuse. I hear the stories in the rooms, and I absolutely, I am so humbled by the resilience of the human spirit, how those people were able to find their way into those rooms and to step and choose recovery.
Right.
Is absolutely amazing to me.
Yeah.
So I hear it almost every time I go into a meeting from someone, and it's stuff you don't hear anywhere else. You don't hear that stuff anywhere on the street. You don't hear it in church. You don't hear it in school. You don't hear it in the shrink's office.
I'm kind of going back a moment.
Sure.
You said something that is like a little aha to me of the fact of this authenticity of being comfortable in your skin, and you finding that later in life. Everyone wants that. My question to you is, do you think that it's stemming from the fact that, we are raised in a society that they don't ask you to look at your emotions, right? Or they don't care what you just need to be successful. And so
you're getting to something really important that's at the core values of life. And then we could talk about core values in a minute. I'd like to throw in a caveat. It's a segue right into what you're asking. I don't know that I ever got comfortable being in my skin. What I've told people that I sponsor and what I've often talked about when I speak at meetings is it's the challenge was learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. That my discomfort isn't an excuse or a reason to go out and sacrifice the great talents that I was given. The challenge is to learn how to be uncomfortable and let that be a norm that I can live with day in, day out, without giving up my compassion, without sacrificing the tools and the great talents that I was given.
I love that.
So that's the journey in a nutshell.
So what are some tools that you use to be uncomfortable? Being comfortable with uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable.
I think that I continually marvel at, and we have a tradition in AA of not presenting ourselves, of not outing ourselves in press, radio, or film. And there's a good reason for that. They went through some stormy weather in the early 40s when people wanted to go national with this emerging institution. But Bill W. and Dr. Bob, they gave us something, or the early old timers gave us something that was just a Bible for us. And in many ways, it's a distillation of all the great spiritual systems,
right? But
we call it the 12 steps. Okay. And in the 12 steps is step number 1. And I will never forget doing step number 1. I had to go to treatment because I had to have medical attention.
Right.
I had a very, very deep addiction to benzodiazepines, which I found out in treatment is probably the worst addiction you can have. Far worse than heroin, far worse than meth. And it goes on, the withdrawals go on for many, many months.
Could you function? Were you writing? Were you working on this?
Yeah, I never missed a day of work.
Wow.
My tolerance level had gotten so high that I was taking upwards of 60 milligrams of Valium a day just to be normal to medicate and manage my acute anxiety. I drank and took drugs, prescription drugs, to manage the acute anxiety that I had began developing in my late 20s. Were just chronic panic attacks where I was going from one grand mal panic attack and a rush trip to the emergency room after another, sometimes 3 times a week. And when you understand the physiology of panic attacks, it made sense that I was just wiped out.
Of course.
Because it burns all the sugar in your pancreas instantly, because you have the fight or flight and the adrenal cortex kicks in. And all of that stored up sugar gets burned, and then your body just feels like you're wiped out for 2 days. Yeah. And then you get up and you try to function and you have another one. Yeah. And so that's how I ended up in that endless loop of addiction to Valium. And I knew I needed medical attention to break out of that. I could not have done it. There's no way I could have done it on my own. So I don't remember your original question, but coming through that was nothing short of horrific. And that's what the New York Times asked me to write about. So I wrote the piece, Joker's Wild. And that's what Heath Ledger was dealing with. That's what Philip Seymour Hoffman was dealing with. We may have stepped over a question you asked just prior to this, but if I did, it wasn't intentional. Sometimes my own narrative starts to get
you're fine.
Take its own direction. The question of self-worth and self valuing. It may have been asked and then answered many years before I ever had my first panic attack. A number of things led up to that first panic attack, and it may have been that answer. Maybe I was trying to prove something. Maybe something was driving me. Maybe something. I grew up in the shadow of a man, my father, who I dearly loved, who was world renowned for what he did. And there was always the question. I knew they were looking at me and watching me. What's he going to do? I always felt like the Huckleberry Finn in the family. And yet I always I knew I had wonderful gifts. And the question was, how is that going to manifest? How is that going to come out? How was I ever going to get there? And did I have the discipline to get there?
But that's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure. It's an enormous amount of pressure. And you know what? When you're in your 20s, I didn't walk around in the world saying, Jesus, this is a lot of pressure. I walked around in the world saying, I want to be a writer, but what am I going to do when I get big? What am I going to do when I get big? What am I going to do when I grow up? You know, the question we asked when we were 4 and 5 and 6 years old. What am I going to do? I knew how challenging being a writer was going to be. And I was on my own. I wasn't getting, even though my mother was a wonderful professor of literature, American literature, my dad was doing what he was doing. Nobody ever said to me, when are you going to stop screwing up? Nobody ever said to me, why don't you get with the program? Oh, my mom did a few times. But all moms do.
Yeah, right? Of course.
So it was more of an internal thing, as you might suggest, a question of maybe self-worth, maybe self-realization. But by then, I was living in a world where alcohol was very much a part of everyday existence. My liver was very healthy. My organs were all very healthy. So I could do it. All of my friends, we could do it. You can do it in your 20s.
Right.
And then what happens is you reach a point. I can't tell you how many people I've met who have come into recovery, who came into recovery between the ages of 32 and 35.
Why that age?
I have no idea. It seems like people reach a breaking point, both chronologically, their own self-expectations, and biochemically, their bodies are starting to kick back. Their bodies are starting to turn on them, and it's getting more and more painful to continue that way.
Now, did you feel that also what was driving it was maybe some guilt and shame then? Where was that showing up in your personal life or professional life?
If it was, I wasn't aware of it.
Okay.
Although I had a very interesting conversation with my father once, and I made a flippant comment about guilt. I dismissed it out of hand, and he raised a finger, as he often would, very calmly, and he said, "You might want to reconsider that." I said, "Well, what are you getting at?" He said, "Consider that maybe there are two kinds of guilt. There is good guilt and there's bad guilt." And I said, "Okay, I'll consider that. So make the distinction for me. Explain it. Help me out here." And I was just sort of being cocky with him. And he wasn't being cocky at all. He was being very serious. He said, "Bad guilt is the kind of guilt you were just describing. It's the manipulation that somebody else imposes on you to extract some kind of behavior or some kind of response to a situation. Good guilt is that emotion you feel when you've abandoned your own core value system."
I like that.
That was a huge epiphany for me.
Of course, yeah.
I have never forgotten that. I have thought of it 1,000 times.
Yeah.
And what that begs, the question it begs is, okay, have you done the work to develop a core value system? What are your core values? Covey says in the 7 Habits, the 7 Principles of Highly Successful People, that these are people who have taken the time to develop an integrated set of core values, know what they are, can name them, and live by them. It takes a lifetime to learn that it takes a lifetime. These are key pieces of wisdom, if you want to call it, that are hard won. You don't get them out of a book. Yeah. You don't get them in a self-help seminar.
Or when you're 20.
And you certainly don't get them when you're 20. Although, like you and I have discussed Viktor Frankl, he was in his probably late 20s when he was in Auschwitz. So he was on the Head Start program.
Right.
When you go through enormous amount of suffering and misery, it accelerates the timeline to wisdom. Right. Avoiding pain. So what I want to go back to very, very briefly is that same man who explained the difference between good guilt and bad guilt was the guy I called when I was 25 years old. And I said, "Dad, I just had an amazing insight as to why I feel so out of place in the United States." Because I had grown up in Latin America.
Okay.
I said, "I'm going to make this sound, and this is going to sound incredibly simplistic, but you raised us, my sisters and my brother, you and Mom raised us in a love-based culture, and you brought us to a fear-based culture. All of us had grown up in a love-based society and culture where we understood." Now, how do you define a love-based culture? A love-based culture is one in which pain and suffering are understood to be givens of life every single day. Carl Jung said, "The source of all neurosis is an inability to suffer, not learning how to suffer." And when you come to a fear-based society, you're surrounded and suddenly immersed in a culture of people who are doing everything they can to avoid pain and suffering. And it's a dramatically different paradigm.
So what does that look like when somebody is accepting pain and suffering.
When you accept pain and suffering, you're released from it. And it looks like big families having huge meals together. It looks like music in the square. It looks like
So nobody's having addictions in Latin cultures?
Very, very low rate
Really?
of addiction. Very low rate of addiction. Very low rate of addiction. Another great example of it is you put Italy next to France.
Right.
France has one of the highest addiction rates in the world. Italy has one of the lowest.
Why?
They have classically different social environments. The social environment in Italy, the cultural environment, the mores are completely different than those in France.
How so?
Italy is profoundly love-based.
Okay. And what's France?
France
Fear?
is much, much more fear-based. Status.
Status,
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah. Driven by that status.
So it's interesting because fear, love, we'll just kind of take it back to the simplistic form of we're looking at separation and connection.
Yep.
And the antidote of suffering is connection.
Yep. Absolutely.
So wrapping it all up, what would you say some solutions are for people who are struggling with addiction?
Everyone has to find their path out of that darkness one way or another. There are some obvious paths out of it, but there are 12-step programs, there's treatment. It depends on where you're at in how deep you are into it. Sometimes you really do have to get the big fires put out before you can put out the smaller ones and start dealing on the personal stuff. In other words, you have to deal with the physical, life-threatening issues straight up before you can start doing the more fine-grained and nuanced work of rebuilding your personal sense of self and who you are. Mm-hmm. You know, the shame that's often attached to that, and it was stigmatized for so many centuries. The shame is the ultimate denial of self. Mm-hmm. And it's pushing that shame back and building little by little a life, again, that's worth living around core values and things that are going to carry you through all the hard times in the future. It's all insurance against picking up that reward of choice that we've talked about, that so many people have done, so many of us have done, so many millions of people have done, that 96 out of 100 that revert to the reward of choice instead of taking paths out of that darkness into some sort of personal light.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge on your process and shining light on the addiction process. And you just have so much wisdom. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
That's it for today's podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. Please let me know what you think. Leave a comment, share, and we'll be back next week with a new episode.